Welcome back. I'm about to show you what we had from the very beginning in the JavaScript language. We didn't have object.create, so we did something different than what you see here. And this approach is even closer to object-oriented programming. Let me show you what we can do. Instead of using object.create, we're going to use something called constructor functions. Let's see how that would look. With a constructor function, let's just remove this for now. It will still be a function, except we're going to create an elf function that takes in name and weapon. And then we're going to remove all this line of code and instead use this dot name equals to name and this dot weapon equal to weapon. Now, here's the interesting part. I'm not returning anything here. I'm using this and that's it. We're constructing an elf. But how does this work? Well, if in here I change this to elf and say elf, and for now let's just comment out these console logs, and I run this, I don't get any errors. That's good. If I do sam.name and I run this, I get a type error. Cannot read property name of undefined. And that's because constructor functions are built like this. And in order to use a constructor function, you need to use the new keyword in JavaScript. So in here, we would add new. And by adding new, let's see what happens. Look at that. That magically worked. Why is that? That is because the new keyword in JavaScript, which, by the way, a lot of people don't like, but it's just the way things work. So we're going to have to get used to it. The new keyword automatically returns the object for us that we have here, and it creates the elf constructor. That is, it runs this code, constructs the elf function for us, and now we have access to Peter and Sam. And any function that is invoked using the new keyword is called a constructor function. And as a matter of fact, we've seen constructor functions before. Remember when we talked about things like number or even object or function? Capital letters, but they were functions? Those were all constructor functions. You invoke them by using the new keyword. So, as a rule, even though you don't need to, you won't get a syntax error. As a rule, all constructor functions should start with a capital letter to let other programmers know that you need to call this function using the new keyword. Let's show you how to create an elf using the constructor function that comes natively in JavaScript. That is the function constructor. Using the function constructor, and this is something that we've seen before in the fundamentals part of the course, where I can say, let's say const elf1 is equal to new function, so that we call this function constructor. And this function constructor will have parameters of name and weapon. And then the last parameter is what the function's actually going to be doing. Now I'm going to use template strings here. And I'm just going to copy and paste this piece of code. And now, if I do const Sarah equals new elf1, let's make sure we use capital letters here because, again, to indicate that we want to use the new keyword. And I'll just say Sarah And Sarah's weapons are going to be, let's say, fireworks. Now if I do Sarah, and look at that, I have name Sarah, weapon. A function constructor or constructor functions are simply that. They allow us to use the new keyword and create these objects for us. Now, in the next video, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what the new keyword does and how constructor functions are used in JavaScript. But before I do that, let's make sure that we implement the attack function on here. Because we've now used the new keyword, and the new keyword automatically returns an elf object for us, and it creates this elf constructor, we've created a new object, and because this function is called, a new execution context is created. And because of that, because this is a function that we're running, and a new execution context is created, that means we automatically get the this variable attached to it. Remember, every function that we call gets the this and the arguments parameters. We remember this, right? This and arguments. The interesting thing, though, is that when we use the new keyword, instead of this pointing to the window object, like it usually does, the new keyword changes what this is pointing to when a new execution context is created. Instead, the new keyword will say, hey, I want you to point this to the object that we just created. So that this now becomes Peter or Sam. And this is what happens if we remove new. If we remove new and I click run, I cannot read property name of undefined. And that's because without the new keyword, we are not creating this object, we are not returning an object, and we're also not assigning this to the object that calls us. So this new keyword does a ton for us behind the scenes in order for it to work. So it's very important that we use the new keyword, which is why we want to use the capital letters to indicate to other programmers, hey, we need to use the new keyword, otherwise it's not going to work. And why this is so powerful is that because this is a function, remember, every function in JavaScript gets automatically a prototype property. Remember this? Functions are special type of objects in JavaScript. It's a callable object that has code that can be invoked, an optional name. It'll have a bunch of properties that, if we want to give it, we have access to. But we also get this prototype that gets created with any new function. Now, this prototype property is absolutely useless with any regular function. But when we have constructor functions, remember the ones with capital letters that we can invoke with new, well, this prototype finally becomes useful. And native constructor functions, like the function, comes with things like call, apply, and bind. Arrays come with things like map, reduce, for each, because they're built out of the array constructor function. In our case, we can add our own to the prototype. So that now we can do elf.prototype, which we have access to, and say attack. So we're adding the attack method on the prototype, and if I do function, return attack with this.weapon, remember, this will be the calling object. What's going to call us? Well, whatever is to the left of the dot. So that if I do run here, I get Sam. But if I do attack and I run, look at that, attack with fire. How awesome is that? Let's make sure both of these work. Click run. Look at that. Peter and Sam can finally attack with stones and fire. And we're able to use the prototype to add functionality to both else. So to review, we're able to use constructor functions instead of something like object.create to create this magical function that creates a new object, returns a new object, and also modifies what this means to whatever object calls us. So instead of the global object, this is now going to point to the calling object, Peter and Sam. But because this is a constructor function, we also have this prototype property that we can attach things to. So that when Peter.attack gets called, well, Peter doesn't have attack as its own method, but it's going to go up the prototype chain. Remember, .proto is going to point to prototype, and this prototype is going to have the attack. And now both Peter and Sam are able to use attack from the same location in memory. Instead of us copying attack multiple places in multiple location in memory, we just have it written once in memory. And both of these elves are going to point to attack, which is in the same memory space. And the beauty is that I can just keep adding functionality here, right? If the game evolves and all of a sudden I say, well, elf can now also use build. Well, now we have a new function that allows us to add functionality to all the elves that we created, and they can now build as well. One other thing. What do you think happens if I change this into an arrow function? If I click run, I get undefined. And we've seen this before, right? Why do we get undefined? Well, because arrow functions are lexically scoped. That is, they define this based on where they're written. And this, in this case, is the global object, because who's calling attack right now? There's no object surrounding it other than the global object. But by using the regular function, which is dynamically scoped, that is, it doesn't matter where it's written, it's whoever calls it. Well, because it's dynamically scoped, this is going to change based on who calls it. So that is the one gotcha where you don't always want to use arrow functions, because sometimes you don't want lexically scoped this. All right, let's take a break and talk a little bit more about this and think about some of the improvements, pros and cons that we have with this. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.